A new book explores the forgotten history of St. Louis. That's next on City Corner. Historic Tales of St. Louis is a new book that explores some things about our city you might not know. I'm Steve Potter, and welcome to City Corner. And I'd like to introduce you to our guest today. That's Mark Zeman. Hi, Mark.
Hi, Steve. Pleasure to be here.
Your book is just out, and I'm right. These are things I think most people, even if they think they know a lot about it, the history of the city, may not have ever heard about.
That's true. I did a lot of research to create a book about things that aren't common. It's not about the arch. It's not about the breweries, things that are really well covered. So this was really an investigative type of a project to really dig down to things that aren't covered and give them some exposure.
Yeah, and how do you find out about stuff? How do you go to a library and research things that nobody knows?
Well, thank God it's not like the old graduate school days with the index and pulling the large things out. You can find almost anything out on the internet now, but you've got to be very thorough and dogged. You just have to keep digging. And often when you find one clue and another conduit, it leads to another and another. So it paves its own path.
Mm-hmm. How long did you work on this?
The actual writing and the research took about 9 months. And I started during COVID because everybody's locked in. So I said, well, it's a good time. You can do your project. You can put an addition to your house, put in a garden, learn a language or write a book. Cliche. But it was a great use of time. I think people should make the best use of their time.
In your book, at the preface, you say that there is no such thing as a definitive history.
Yes.
So what do you mean by that?
Well, everything has a perspective. So if you're the British during the Revolutionary War, their recollection and what they teach in their schools would be pretty different than what the Americans put on theirs. One would be, these are the rebels, while the other would say, we're the freedom fighters. So when you apply that kind of a rule to St. Louis, you can say, well, this is a great thing. However, when you start digging down, you might find other layers of facts that it's not a good nor a bad. It's just what happens. And I'm really adamant in the writing of history that it's just disclosure. I'm not trying to present something other than the fact.
Well, in your book, Historic Tales of St. Louis, you have how many tales? 80-something?
There's 88 individual stories.
Uh-huh. And some are long, some are short.
Yep.
But why don't we just get right into it?
Sure.
And look at the first one. Now, this is an old image of a boat, maybe on the Mississippi. What is it?
Yes, this is a Union gunship. This takes place in the Civil War, and as we all know, the advent of this transition from wooden sailing vessels to these other vessels came at this time in the Americas. The South, the Confederate Navy, introduced the gunship with essentially metal plates on the side that was more or less impervious to artillery of the time. Mm-hmm. So they would simply float up to a regular wooden ship and just decimate it. They would punch holes right through them.
Wow.
And they could just go boat to boat. So the Union had to reply immediately. The purpose of that was that whoever controlled the river had a great advantage in moving the materiel, the men, troops, and control the commerce. So this boat here was built, this is the USS Cairo, and it was built by James Eads. Now everybody would recall that that individual is the one that built Eads Bridge.
Right.
So he also constructed a fleet of riverine on the Mississippi ironclad boats to control and restrict access of the Confederates. And they could also bombard coastal facilities too.
And I was guessing, I don't know the age of this photograph, but wouldn't this, you mentioned Eads and the Eads Bridge, wouldn't this have been before there was a bridge across the Mississippi?
Yes, that's correct. And so it's important to know too that he was not a shipbuilder, because this had never been created by anybody. Nobody knew how to manufacture these things. Mm-hmm. And so they simply kind of copied the Confederates' approach and just got angled holes and put slabs of metal on them.
Interesting. Let's go to the next one. Here is a fella and his friend. That's the best way I can describe it.
This chapter is about the St. Louis Zoo, less to do with the zoo itself and more of the history. This is a gentleman who's from Africa and who was brought over with dozens and dozens of other peoples from other countries and nations during the 1904 World's Fair. And essentially they were brought in to exhibit how they live in their native lands. So you would have an Inuit from Alaska, people from Thailand and so on,
Right.
were brought and they recreated their homes and the tools they had. So you see this individual here, he's wearing his traditional costume. So the backdrop to all this was that this was in the 1904 World's Fair. This was a large exhibit of technology and how wonderful it's become and how Americans in particular are sophisticated in technology and so advanced. And a subtext when you put these people on display was at the time essentially that the Western culture is the pinnacle of human evolution and that these people were a notch down.
Yeah, wasn't there some criticism at that time of the World's Fair, either then or later, about how these kind of displays, I guess they weren't meant to be, but kind of dehumanized these people?
There was at the time, it was really not thought of during the fair, but it really came to represent that. This gentleman's tale is particularly noted because once the World Fair was concluded, he had an opportunity to go back to Africa, but they invited him to stay. So he worked at the St. Louis Zoo while he was here, and once he eventually moved to New York. Once he was there, he started having a lot of issues. You can imagine integrating into a modern society after living in a tribal community. Mm-hmm. He ultimately hurled a chair at a New York socialite, which was not a good career move. And they said, well, you got to move out of here. So they put this man in the Bronx Zoo. And when I say they put him, he was working there, and then someone came up with a brilliant idea. Well, let's put him on exhibit. So they took this man and placed him in a cage with an orangutan because they thought they could sell tickets. And they did. They sold triple the amount of tickets they were normally selling. And originally it wasn't one word of protest. Nobody's arguing this is a bad thing to do. And then eventually the churches and African American society said, what's going on here? But they said, but the money, we need to have this.
I hope he was compensated well, but I bet he wasn't.
No, he wasn't. He didn't receive, to my knowledge, he didn't receive any money. And I won't go into the details of what happened to this man. You can read up on that. But it's a rather ignominious ending after that.
Historic Tales of St. Louis is the book. Now, the next shot we have is a building. I guess there's a story behind that.
Yes, this is on Sublette right here in town. It's another Civil War story. There's an old adage that wherever an army goes, the supporting women follow. Uh-huh. And that's because there are men away from home and they're stressed and so on. And so it's not an apology for it. But as a consequence, all the troops in the Union Army came from Maine and Minnesota. All of them came down through St. Louis. And right across the street at what's now Aloe Plaza was where the working girls would welcome them to St. Louis. The Army was saying, what are we going to do? Because the church folk and everyone said, well, we can't have this going rampant. And they said, there's no way to stop this. We have no control. So what we can do is let's take a page from the Europeans and legalize it, and then we can give the girls health care.
You know, when I read that, I had no idea that prostitution was legal here.
It was legal here. This is the first, it wasn't Nevada, it was St. Louis that had the first place that legalized prostitution. There's the end chapter of here is about one of the most wealthy women in the city was a madam who was buried, I've actually visited her gravesite. She's buried in Bell Fountain Cemetery. And when they were trying to get her admitted, and they said, the owners said, we cannot let a madam be buried here with all the good people. So they wouldn't let her. But the public outcry was so intense because she was so popular. She had a wonderful habit of taking her money and all of her wealth and sharing it among the poor and providing medical care and all this for these people.
No kidding.
And so they demanded they let her in. So they let her in, but they forbid her a headstone. So you just put a little stick where she's buried underneath. But back to the original, if you would like to put up the photo of the building again, this is where that ties in. The structure is, it was called the Social Evil Hospital. So if there was ever a name that kind of put a...
It kind of says it.
Yeah, It lets you know what the people think of it already. And here it is, and the girls would come in for checkups. So and if somebody had an infection, they would just pull them out, and so it wouldn't propagate. I mean, this could have decimated the war effort.
Okay, you lost me an infection. Let's move ahead.
We'll move out of there.
Before we take our break, let's take a look at another one, and this is a riverfront scene.
Yes. If you to the far right, you see a steamship with all the smoke billowing out of its two plumes, and this was right near the bridge. If you remember Mr. Eads, he's the one that built our famous bridge. Before the arch, the Eads Bridge was the symbol of St. Louis because it could not have been built. They just said, it can't be done. The river's too large, it's too wide, it's too deep. You can't do it. So he engineered a way to do it. But before that, here we have these trains would be from the East Coast, and they'd pull in, loaded with goods, and they'd come to the Illinois side, load all of their cargo, all their rail carts, onto a ferry boat, and then it would just drive right over here and unload them and rehook to another locomotive. So while you could say, we all remember the Intercontinental Railroad, Transcontinental, so where they tapped in the spike, that wasn't really true. It didn't make it a seamless connection because there was no bridge for quite a while. All of the trains would come, stop, and shovel over to this side, and then get back on tracks and go again. So it wasn't until they built the bridge that it was truly a transcontinental railroad.
You know, I've thought of that after learning what you just said. When you cross the Eads Bridge, think of it then. You don't think about how big, when you cross on a bridge, you don't realize, think how big the Mississippi is, the turbulent water. And I kind of imagine before there was a bridge, try to picture it in my mind. Going across in a boat, it must have been sort of a harrowing experience.
Well, it's certainly the widest spot here, but virtually everything that was all the finished nails, every surgical implement, every round of ammunition that was in St. Louis was brought by ferry, and every person was too. Everything that was modern came on a boat across here until that time.
And think about 50, 60 years before that when they probably crossed in little canoes and things.
They had.
But probably half the people didn't make it.
There's a chapter in here about all of the methodologies and retraces from the early French boats, the bateaux that just went upstairs, and they would take long poles and walk them up, or where it was allowable, they would take mules and tow them up the edge of it. But can you imagine at a time? And then it wasn't until at New Orleans they would put steamships, and then things really started moving.
Well, this is the tip of the iceberg. Historic Tales of St. Louis is the book. We're going to continue with Mark right after this on City Corner.
Selfie. Nailed it.
I'm Steve Potter. Welcome back to City Corner. Mark Zeman is our guest. His new book is Historic Tales of St. Louis. It's 80-something stories about St. Louis that I guess you didn't learn in school, right?
No, I didn't.
Little things. Just give our viewers an example. You have topics, everything from the race riots of 1917 to being able to see Barbra Streisand for $2 in Gaslight Square to the first drive-through window. I mean, everything, A to Z.
It really tries to hit on a lot of things that aren't common knowledge. And what I was looking for to achieve was that people would say, wow, I didn't know that. And it was something that if you just dig around, you can find these amazing little tidbits. And then collectively, when you start putting a lot of these stories together, they form a really good picture of this city.
Let's take a look at another picture from your book. This is a park, I think, somewhere. Well, that's what it looks like to me.
Oh, yes, this is at Creve Coeur. This was taken in 1910. This is, of course, after the 1904 World's Fair. And people who lived in the cities, this is an era when they didn't have transportation.
Creve Coeur would be like a day trip, right?
Creve Coeur is an incredible distance from downtown, which 90% of the people in the region live. So the factory workers lived and worked down there, and their wives, there's no trolley earlier, so they couldn't live more than 10 minutes away. So at this juncture, the city or the companies built a rail line all the way to Creve Coeur. And of course, you have Creve Coeur Lake at the bottom, but at the top of that the little hill, that's where this is. This is called the DeForest Observation Tower, and it was built and put on display in the 1904 World's Fair as a wireless telegraph. And of course, at the end of the fair, they don't have any use for it, so they put it at the top of that hill, and you had a really commanding view, as you can see here.
I just want to ask you a little bit about yourself real quickly before we go any further, because you can't answer the most important question that we always ask everyone. You know where I'm going to.
Yes, I do.
Where did you go to high school? Because you didn't. So it's really interesting to me anyway, that someone would write such a detailed book of history who's not even from here. And you were an adult when you moved here. So just real briefly, tell me about your career and how you ended up here.
Well, I lived in many places growing up. Were you a military brat? I think the same as you. And I said, no, I just had, the parents would follow the money. Wherever you can get work was where we went. And so I, born in Idaho, went to Montana, and then Wyoming, back to Montana, Washington State, California. So I came here with my then wife, where she went to school out here. And so I've been here for 25 years now. So, but I can't answer that question. You know, I went to this high school. And when I say Billings West High is a joke, they go, hey, I thought I knew all of those.
The book is Historic Tales of St. Louis. So let's look at another image. And this one is, I'm guessing it's a women's vote rally?
Yes, this is a suffrage movement that went from the Jefferson Hotel all the way to Washington. After the Civil War, we all know that afterwards, as the Constitution was given an amendment to enable African Americans to vote. It wasn't entirely true, because African American women still couldn't vote. They were not allowed to, as are all of these women here. And after the war, and the women had really stepped up in an industrialized society, we work, we contribute, we are citizens, we should all get the vote. And this is one of the first ones. This was an enormous amount of women that got together to ask for the right. They didn't get it after this movement, they got it subsequent to this. But it was, the figures varied. One figure said 3,000 participants, others said 5. So you can take your pick.
But back then, that was a radical thing to do.
It was a radical to have a woman essentially protest anything.
They weren't allowed to hold up signs.
No, women couldn't own a credit card until 1978. If you were an adult female in this country, and it was 1977, you needed your husband's or father's signature.
I wish I wasn't allowed to have a credit card, but that's another story. Let's look at this next image. And this is a building almost. I mean, we can almost see it. So what's going on here?
This is another distinction that St. Louis has, is that we used to have the nation's worst air pollution. This is the civil courts building. It's right nearby where the town hall and administrative.
Right, and this wasn't a foggy day. This was the pollution in the air.
This is noon on a regular business day. The backstory to this is that in this era, there's factories everywhere in the city, and the factories had these tall smokestacks, and they all operated and burned coal. So each time they burned it, this is what the result is. They had locomotives, houses burned coal, businesses, apartments, all burned coal. And that's just one facet of it. The coal that they chose was the coal from Illinois, which is called lignite. It's a very soft coal, and it's high in sulfur content, and it burns dirty, and that's the best way to put it. So when you see that photograph, that's like at 11 o'clock on a sunny day, and that's what you see. Now imagine breathing it,
No.
and nobody stopped to think, boy, maybe this isn't healthy for you.
Of course, people died in their 40s back then.
Yeah, well, some people did. But they said, why don't we do something about this? This is getting really horrible. And then the city commissioned a health program to examine it, and it immediately met with resistance. And who other than the businesses that operate it,
Right.
and the coal companies. They said, look, if we have to switch to bituminous coal from, say, West Virginia, it's going to add 20% to cost. It's going to cost. We can't do that. And then the best part of this whole article was the man who was the head of the Illinois Coal Association said that the people that want to care about your health were tyrants. They're tyrants.
Doesn't kind of remind you about the whole solar conversation we're having now in a weird sort of way?
The money flavors everybody's opinion.
Yeah. In this next image, I like this one because I think it sort of represents transportation of the day. Probably the three main ways you could travel, right? A trolley, a car, and a horse.
Yeah, that's exactly right. It's one of my favorite photos just because of that. And it reveals an underlying structure in a city, because before modernization, a factory, the work is here. So the man, always the man worked, and the wife had to live in that location, and he works typically 12 to 14-hour days, 6 to 7 days a week. They're exhausted. So, and they're not going to want to walk 30 minutes after putting in that day.
Right.
So they live very near. The wife, and this is also the day, it's a reflection of how we shop differently. You would have a butcher, you'd have a baker, you'd have the greengrocer, you'd have all these different shops. So the woman would come out. Imagine your 105-degree St. Louis day. The woman's out in a hoop skirt, and you saw the horse. Now, picture what happens when you have horses on the street. Mm-hmm. Hundreds of them.
Watch where you step.
Watch where you step. And now it's 105. You have 4 children you have to tote with you, and you're carrying that. And you have to go to the baker first, and then you go to the greengrocer, and you're not going to live more than 5 or 10 minutes away because you can't. So this story is important because with the advent of the streetcar, you can now, they put it on a line, and then businesses and things would crop up around it. So a woman living here could walk a block, catch the streetcar, go back, and you're not exhausted. You don't have to step in the fill and get your dress all messy. And then you could just set your parcels next to you. It revolutionized the way people acted, and now all those lines were, and people would build out further. So the city grew 10 times the size. Because you have the ability to get somewhere for a nickel, you could take a drive.
In this next image from your book, it looks like somebody's got backyard problems. Worse than my yard. That's worse than my yard.
That's a bad photo. Yeah. This, if everybody recalls their history about the Great Depression, it's a time when many, many people lost their jobs. A stock market crash, things like that. Where did those people go? Well, if they had family, they moved in with family, and if friends that could take them in for a while till they get back on their feet. St. Louis has yet another ignominious honor of having the largest shanty town in the United States. Mm-hmm. And this where we're looking at is the Arch grounds. This is before the Arch. And at that point, it was just the riverfront. So if this man, these were not low-income people, a lot of regular homeowners, they had savings, they lost their own businesses, they lost their homes, they have nothing. And now they would go and scavenge sheets of lumber, bricks, anything to put these little shanties together. And they called these areas, they wanted to blame someone, so they blamed President Hoover and called them Hoovervilles, just to give it to him.
Right.
And so the community, this is a bad image of the American society, and it's also a very good reflection of St. Louis, because the churches band together to provide support. A lot of the medical facilities still continue to provide care. Neighbors and associations would help wherever they can. Even though these people were down on luck, they were not abandoned. And they provided for themselves. This shanty town that was in town constructed its own church, had its own mayor, and created some schools.
My goodness. Mark, you've got a couple of Facebook pages. Is that related to all this history, or is that something different?
Oh, I have a couple that are piggybacked on my own Facebook page. One is St. Louis sculpture. And that's, again, during COVID. Who knew it was going to last as long as it did? So I didn't really get out. So I said, I'm going to need another good project. So I identified and went and photographed and researched. It's up to 860 sculptures within the city of St. Louis. And it's a great deal of work to find them, to know about them, and then go driving to every single one of them to photograph. And I put them on a Facebook page that has a locator map. It's really actually kind of cool. You can get on there, you click, open the map, and you see it's nothing but blue dots, little markers. And you can click on them, and it pops up the photo and the narrative. It's very interesting.
Something else you mentioned in the book I want you to explain to me. I think it was the last sentence in your preface. You said that after reading this book, you will not be unchanged. So I'm not sure what you meant by that.
I think, I don't mind, I'm probably like most people. If I read a book and I go, well, that might have been entertaining. And that's a lot of history books are written that way, to inform and then to make it a fun story. A couple of the articles in here are fun. The famous Hollywood person that created the leaving a mint on a pillow, that's not a significant story.
That's the Cary Grant story in here, right? Oh, sorry.
Yes, it's Cary Grant, cat's out of the bag. So he did it right here in town, and that's a cute story. I love that story because it's warm and fun, but it's not like the Hooverville.
We just have a minute left.
Okay.
But what do you hope this book does? Will this help us understand things better? I don't know. What do you think?
I think it will. What I'm hopeful for is because that people will say, that I didn't know about. And that's something people do need to know about. When you're talking about, it's just one example, that, okay, African Americans can now vote, but the state of Missouri said, okay, you now have the right to vote. We're going to make it a legal requirement to pass a literacy test. And then they enact legislation that forbids the teaching of African Americans to read. So I don't know how many people do or don't know that, but I know a lot of people who don't. And that's an important thing to know.
All right, what's the best way to get your book?
You can get it online virtually everywhere, and anywhere from Amazon, Target's carrying it, as it does, just Google the title. And the brick and mortar stores, Barnes and Noble, places, Spine Bookstore is carrying it.
And it's by the History Press, so go to historypress.com. Historic Tales of St. Louis. Mark Zeman has been our guest. You got anything in the works?
I've got something coming up next
Will
year.
you tell me during the break?
I'll tell you during the break.
Okay.
But I want to let the cat out of the bag.
Mark, thanks so much. It's really a fascinating book and great coffee table book for sure.
Oh, great. I'm glad you enjoyed it. Thank you very much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Mark Zeman, thank you. Historic Tales of St. Louis. Check it out. I'm Steve Potter. Thank you for being a part of the City Corner, and I hope you'll join us next time. Bye.